The vast emptiness of space stretched endlessly, dotted with distant stars. In the middle of the black void, a sleek human warship, Iron Fang, drifted in complete silence. Its engines were cold, running on minimal power, making it nearly invisible to the scanners of any nearby ships. Inside, the crew of elite human soldiers prepared for what could be their last mission. Commander Elias Voss stood in the dimly lit briefing room, his sharp eyes scanning his team. They were some of the best fighters humanity had, each of them trained for deep space infiltration and high-risk extractions. Tonight, they weren't going after weapons or data. They were here for a person. Dr. Mara Thorne, a brilliant scientist kidnapped by the alien forces that ruled this sector of the galaxy. "We go in fast, we go in quiet," Elias said, his voice firm but calm. "No unnecessary kills. Our only goal is to extract Dr. Thorne and get out before anyone knows we were there." The team nodded. They knew the stakes. Dr. Thorne wasn't just any scientist. She had developed a prototype nanovirus, a weapon capable of shutting down the AI-controlled war machines of the Tyrix Dominion. If the aliens cracked her research, they could turn it against humans. This mission wasn't just a rescue. It was about preventing the extinction of humanity. Elias turned to Sergeant Bonner, his second in command, a towering soldier with a face full of battle scars. "You ready?" Bonner smirked. "Always." Their target was a massive black market space station known as the Dark Market, a place where anything could be bought, from illegal AI to entire planets, and even sentient beings. No laws, no mercy. It was ruled by a ruthless alien overlord known as the Collector, a being so feared that even warlords whispered his name in hushed tones. The plan was simple. The Iron Fang would use its cloaking device to get as close as possible, then deploy the team in a stealth pod. They would infiltrate the station, locate Dr. Thorne, and extract her before anyone noticed. But things never went according to plan. As the ship moved closer, something strange happened. The cloaking field flickered, just for a second, but enough for Elias to notice. His gut twisted. "Status?" he asked. Lieutenant Kara, their tech specialist, frowned at the readings. "We're being scanned." "Impossible," Bonner muttered. "This ship is undetectable." "Not anymore," Kara replied. "Something, no, someone, just pinged us. They know we're here." Before Elias could react, a deep metallic voice crackled through their comms, cold and emotionless. "Welcome, humans. We've been expecting you." Then hell broke loose. A massive alien warship decloaked directly behind them, its jagged black hull bristling with weaponry. Red warning lights flashed inside the Iron Fang as alarms blared. "They'd locked weapons on us," Kira shouted. Elias clenched his fists. They had walked right into a trap. Evasive maneuvers. Full burn. He ordered, but before their engines could ignite, a bright blue energy beam lanced through space, striking their shields. The ship shook violently, sparks flying from the consoles. "Shields at 50%, Kara reported, her hands flying over the controls. Another blast rocked the ship. They wouldn't survive a third. "Options," Elias demanded. "We can't outgun them," Bonner said, "but we might be able to outthink them." Elias exhaled sharply. They still had one chance. "Drop all power except life support," he ordered. "Make it look like we're dead in the water." Bonner hesitated, then nodded. Within seconds, the ship went dark. No engines, no weapons, just a lifeless hunk of metal drifting in space. On the enemy warship, the alien commander watched in silence. After a moment, he let out a low, guttural laugh. "Pathetic." A new message crackled through the comms. "Surrender or be destroyed." Elias pressed a button on his wrist device, activating the secure channel to his team. His voice was low but steady. "Get to the drop pod. Now." Without waiting for a response, he moved. The team sprinted through the dark corridors of the Iron Fang, their boots silent against the metal floors. They'd reached the drop bay, where a small, stealth insertion pod waited. It was cramped, barely enough room for 6 people, but it was their only chance. As they strapped in, Kiera hacked the ship's mainframe, setting up a delayed power surge. In exactly 30 seconds, the Iron Fang's reactor would pulse, creating a burst of energy that would briefly blind enemy sensors. That was their window. The countdown began. 30 seconds. Elias took a deep breath, gripping his rifle. 20 seconds. The alien warship moved closer, scanning the supposedly dead human ship. 10 seconds. The collector's voice echoed through the comms. "This is disappointing. I expected more of you." 5 seconds. The ship's reactor hummed to life. 3, 2, 1. The energy pulse exploded outward. At that exact moment, the drop pod launched, disappearing into the void. The enemy ship never saw it. Inside the pod, the team barely breathed as they drifted toward the dark market. The pulse had worked. The aliens were too busy scanning the Iron Fang to notice the small, silent capsule moving toward their station. Elias checked the coordinates. They were on course. But something about this still felt wrong. "This was too easy," he muttered. Bonner raised an eyebrow. "Easy? We almost got blown out of the sky." Elias didn't answer. He couldn't shake the feeling that someone wanted them here. The trap wasn't the warship. That was just the bait. The real danger was waiting for them inside the dark market. As the pod moved closer, the station loomed into view. A massive, sprawling structure built from the ruins of 1,000 stolen ships. Bright neon lights flashed across its surface, advertising the unthinkable. The closer they got, the more they saw. Cages filled with sentient beings, AI cores sold to the highest bidder, and weapons powerful enough to destroy entire planets. Elias exhaled slowly. He had seen war. He had seen death. But this was evil. The pod latched onto a docking bay with a soft hiss. A green light flickered. They had arrived. Elias looked at his team. Their faces were grim, but their eyes burned with determination. He raised his weapon. "Let's get our girl and burn this place to the ground." With that, the doors slid open, and they stepped into the darkness. The docking bay of the dark market was dimly lit, the air thick with the scent of oil, burning metal, and something worse, something rotten. As the pod's hatch slid open, Elias Voss stepped out first, his grip firm on his plasma rifle. The rest of the team followed, their boots silent against the cold steel floor. They were in. A towering insectoid alien, its exoskeleton covered in crude armor, stomped past them, barely sparing a glance. Around them, aliens of every kind moved in the shadows, reptilian traders with glowing red eyes, cybernetic mercenaries with metal limbs humming softly, and massive, four-armed brutes dragging cages filled with captives. The team had seen horrors of war before, but this was different. This was a place where sentient beings were sold like objects. Elias clenched his jaw as his earpiece crackled. Kira's voice came through. "Scanners up. Thorn is somewhere in the upper levels. Auction house. Auction." The word sent a chill through him. "Stay close," Elias murmured. They moved quickly, blending into the crowd. Their disguises, patched-up armor, mismatched weapons, made them look like just another group of mercenaries here to trade. But one wrong move could expose them. Bonner walked beside him, scanning the area. "This place is worse than I imagined," he muttered. Ahead, a hunched alien with mechanical tentacles barked in a guttural voice. Fresh Terrans, strong bodies, sharp minds. Prime candidates for cybernetic enhancement ore. He cut off with a gurgle as a buyer stuffed a handful of glowing credits into his clawed hand. Two human captives, barely more than skin and bones, were shoved forward. Elias felt his fists tighten. He wanted to shoot the slaver on the spot, but he forced himself to look away, one mission at a time. They passed through a massive archway leading into the heart of the market. The space opened into a vast underground city, built from scavenged ships and industrial ruins. Rusted metal towers stretched toward a high ceiling covered in flickering neon signs. The air buzzed with thousands of voices, the sounds of weapons being tested, engines roaring, and creatures screaming. Kiera checked her wrist device. Auction house is dead ahead. 2 floors up. Elias led them through the streets, careful not to draw attention. Everywhere, horrific deals were being made. Cybernetic implants drilled into screaming victims. Eye cores ripped from dying machines. A vat of writhing cloned organs, pulsing as if still alive. They'd reached a checkpoint. A pair of heavily armed sentries, their armor black with the emblem of the Collector, stood at the entrance of a spiraling staircase. Getting through without a fight wasn't an option. Bonner leaned close. "Take them quietly." Elias nodded. 2 quick, precise movements. Bonner stepped up to the first guard, pretending to ask for directions. Before the alien could react, Bonner drove a blade into its throat, silencing it instantly. At the same moment, Elias grabbed the second guard, twisting its neck with a sharp crack. They dragged the bodies into the shadows. The crowd moved on, oblivious. They climbed the stairs, weapons ready. At the top, a set of massive double doors loomed before them, guarded by a hulking reptilian brute with cybernetic arms. He scanned the approaching figures with his glowing yellow eyes. "Invitation," he growled. Kiera flicked her wrist, projecting a forged holographic pass onto her palm. The brute's eyes narrowed, scanning it. A tense second passed. Then he stepped aside. They entered the auction hall. It was a massive circular chamber with tiered seating filled with buyers, crime lords, rogue warlords, and slavers, all watching the stage below. The floor was lined with cages, each containing a captive. Some were aliens, others were human. And in the center of the stage, Dr. Mara Thorne stood in chains. Elias's chest tightened. She was alive, but barely. Her face was bruised, her wrists bound by high-tech restraints that pulsed with electric currents. A towering figure stood beside her, a monstrous being, its body draped in flowing robes of deep crimson. The Collector. Its voice echoed through the hall, deep and resonant. "A rare prize," it said, gesturing toward Thorne. "A human mind unlike any other. A scientist who holds the key to war and peace." The audience murmured in excitement. The bidding began. Elias turned to his team. "We need a new plan." Kira's fingers flew over her wrist device. "I can override the restraints, but we need a distraction." Bonner exhaled sharply. "I'll make one." Elias grabbed his arm. "Make sure you survive it." Bonner smirked. "No promises." Before Elias could stop him, Bonner stepped forward and threw a pulse grenade into the crowd. The explosion wasn't lethal, but it sent shockwaves of electricity through the room, shorting out lights and sending alien buyers crashing to the floor. Panic erupted. In that split second of chaos, Kiera activated her hack. Thorne's restraints sparked and unlocked. The scientist collapsed, weak but free. Elias and Kiera sprinted toward her. From the shadows, Bonner opened fire, taking down guards as the buyers scrambled for cover. The Collector did not move. It watched Elias with cold amusement. "You have come far," it said, its voice cutting through the chaos. "But you will not leave." A massive door slammed shut, sealing them inside. Elias grabbed Thorne, pulling her up. "Can you run?" She nodded weakly. "I'll try." The Collector raised a hand. A new set of guards flooded into the hall. Not just ordinary enforcers. These were something worse. Cybernetic super soldiers. Elias cursed under his breath. They were outnumbered, outgunned, and trapped. The Collector smiled. "Let the hunt begin." The room was chaos. Smoke filled the air, alarms blared, and the screams of terrified buyers echoed across the auction hall. Elias Voss tightened his grip on Dr. Mira Thorne's arm as she struggled to stay on her feet. They had freed her, but now they were trapped. The collector's guards, cybernetic super soldiers with glowing red eyes and reinforced armor, were closing in fast. Bonner fired first, his plasma rifle spitting blue streaks of energy into the nearest guard. The shot hit the soldier's chest, but instead of falling, the alien just staggered back, armor smoking. Then, with inhuman speed, it lunged forward, swinging a massive blade at Bonner's head. Bonner barely dodged. "Okay, these guys are tough," he shouted. Elias pulled Thorne behind cover, while Kiera took position near a fallen auction table, typing furiously on her wrist device. "I'm trying to hack the exit doors," she called out. "But they're on a separate security grid. It's gonna take a minute." "We don't have a minute," Elias muttered, watching the guards regroup. The collector hadn't moved from his place on the stage. He simply stood there, watching them struggle, his robe flowing like living shadow. A deep, amused voice echoed through the room. "Humans, so fragile, so desperate." The collector lifted one hand, and the super soldiers surged forward. Bonner grabbed a fallen grenade from one of the dead buyers and threw it at the charging soldiers. The explosion was deafening, sending shockwaves rippling through the air. When the smoke cleared, 3 of the soldiers were down, but more were coming. Elias cursed. They needed to get out. "Now, cover me," Kiera yelled. Elias turned just in time to see Kiera sprint toward the control console on the far side of the room. Plasma fire rained down around her as she slid behind a column, yanking out a cable and plugging it into her wrist device. "I can override the doors from here," she called out. "Just hold them off." Elias spun back toward the fight. Bonner had taken a hit, a deep gash along his shoulder. But he was still firing, his teeth gritted in pain. A massive 4-armed soldier broke through the chaos, charging straight at Elias. Its armor was thick, its face hidden behind a skull-like mask. Elias raised his rifle and fired, but the soldier didn't slow down. It reached him in seconds. A metal fist slammed into Elias's chest, knocking the wind out of him and sending him crashing into a pile of overturned chairs. His vision blurred, the room spinning around him. The soldier raised a massive blade, ready to finish him off. Then Bonner tackled it from the side, slamming a combat knife into the exposed wiring of its neck. Sparks flew as the massive alien twitched violently, its red eyes flickering before it finally collapsed. Bonner grinned and offered Elias a hand. "Told you I'd make a distraction." Elias grabbed his hand, pulling himself up. His chest ached, but there was no time for pain. "The doors," he shouted. Kiera grinned. "Almost there." The collector finally stepped off the stage. The massive figure moved with unnatural grace, gliding across the floor. "Enough," he said. A wave of invisible force slammed into Elias and the others, sending them crashing into walls and furniture. The air turned heavy, like a crushing weight pressing down on their bodies. Elias struggled to breathe. His arms felt like they were made of lead. The collector stepped closer, his dark, alien eyes locking onto Elias. "You think you are strong. You think you are different from the others who came before you." Elias tried to move, but his limbs refused to obey. The collector raised a clawed hand. "I will peel the secrets from your minds." Slowly. Then, suddenly, the lights flickered. For the first time, the collector hesitated. Kiera grinned. "And that's my cue." The doors behind them exploded open. Emergency lights bathed the hall in flashing red as security systems overloaded and shut down. The crushing force holding them down vanished. Elias gasped and dove for his weapon. Bonner was already moving, grabbing Thorne and pushing her toward the exit. "Go! Go! Go!" Elias shouted. They sprinted for the doors, plasma fire raining down around them. The super soldiers were still recovering, their systems disrupted by Kiera's hack, but they wouldn't be down for long. Elias turned back, just for a second. and saw the collector watching them with cold amusement. "You cannot escape me," the alien said, his voice cutting through the chaos. Then he raised his hand again. The walls trembled. A deep mechanical rumbling shook the entire market. Elias had no time to wonder what was happening. "Move," he shouted. They ran through the corridors, dodging panicked aliens who were fleeing in every direction. Some had no idea what was happening. Others just wanted to get out before they became collateral damage. Elias's comm buzzed. "Iron Fang to ground team," a familiar voice called. "You just set off every alarm in this place. We need to extract you now." Elias tapped his earpiece as he ran. "Get to the secondary docking bay. We'll meet you there." "Copy that. You've got 3 minutes." 3 minutes. That was all the time they had before the collector sent everything he had after them. Kira pulled up a map on her wrist device. "This way." They turned a corner and almost ran straight into a platoon of collector's enforcers. Too many to fight. Elias scanned the corridor. There, a side passage. "This way," he barked. They sprinted into a narrow service tunnel, doors slamming shut behind them as Bonner threw an explosive charge at the entrance. The explosion shook the ground behind them. They kept running. Ahead, a blast door marked the docking bay, but it was already closing. Come on," Elias urged. They sprinted full speed and dived through just as the doors slammed shut behind them. The Iron Fang's drop shuttle was already there, its ramp down, engines hot. A new alarm blared overhead. "Something's coming," Kira said, breathless. Elias didn't look back. "Get on the ship." They rushed aboard as the shuttle lifted off. Through the window, Elias saw it. A massive biomechanical warship emerging from the depths of the station. The collector's personal vessel. The ship's main cannon charge. Elias barely had time to shout, "Burn engines." Now, the pilot punched the thrusters. The shuttle rocketed forward as a blinding energy beam tore through the docking bay, missing them by inches. The dark market shrank behind them, alarms still blaring. Elias collapsed into a seat, heart pounding. They had escaped. But he knew this wasn't over. The collector was coming. And next time, there would be nowhere to run. The Iron Fang's drop shuttle hurtled through the void, engines burning hard as it escaped the dark market. Elias Voss sat strapped into his seat, heart still pounding from the chaos they had just survived. Across from him, Bonner winced as Kira patched up his wounded shoulder. Dr. Mara Thorne sat between them, her hands still shaking, eyes staring blankly at the floor. No one spoke. The cockpit door hissed open, and the pilot, a grizzled veteran named Wark, turned back. "We're clear." That thing, whatever it was, didn't follow. Elias let out a slow breath. That should have been a relief, but something felt wrong. The collector had let them escape too easily. He should have chased them down, torn them apart. Instead, he had let them go. Bonner broke the silence. "We need to talk about what the hell just happened. Those weren't just normal guards back there. Those things were something else." Kira nodded. "Cybernetic super soldiers, yeah. But the tech they had, it's beyond anything I've ever seen." She looked at Elias and the collector. That wasn't just some crime lord, was it? Elias met her gaze. No, it wasn't. He turned to Thorne. She had been silent since they'd boarded, but now she finally lifted her head. "I know what he is," she whispered. Everyone's attention snapped to her. "The collector isn't just a slaver or a warlord," she said, voice barely above a breath. "He's something much worse. He's building something. Something. Alive." Elias felt a cold chill run through him. "Explain." Thorne swallowed hard. "He's using cybernetics, AI, and biological augmentation to create an army. One that doesn't think, doesn't feel, just obeys." She took a shuddering breath. "He calls them the Reclaimed." Bonner muttered a curse. "And he wanted you to help him finish it." She nodded. He's close. Too close. If he perfects the process, no one will be able to stop him. Silence fell over the shuttle. Then the ship's comms crackled. Iron Fang, this is the Tempest. We have you on scanners. Bring them home. Elias exhaled. Their mission was over. They had survived. Now, it was time to return to the fleet. The Tempest was a monstrous battleship, one of the last strongholds of humanity's resistance. As the drop shuttle approached, docking clamps extended, pulling them into the hangar bay. The ship's interior was cold, metallic, a stark contrast to the chaos of the dark market. As they stepped off the shuttle, Captain Alden Grayson was waiting for them. Tall, broad-shouldered, with a face carved from stone, he barely acknowledged Elias before his eyes locked onto Thorn. "You got her," he said simply. Elias nodded. "We got her." Grayson turned to Thorn. "I assume you have intel." Thorn hesitated, then nodded. "Yes, but it's worse than we thought." "Of course it is." Grayson sighed, rubbing his temples. "We'll debrief in the war room." They moved through the halls, soldiers and officers stepping aside as they passed. The Tempest was one of the last ships standing in the fight against the Collector and his forces. Every person aboard had lost something: family, homes, entire planets. Inside the war room, a massive holographic display flickered to life, showing a galactic map riddled with red zones, territories already lost to the Collector. Thorn stepped forward, her hands trembling slightly. "The Collector isn't just expanding. He's converting." She pressed a button, and a new image appeared, a grainy transmission of a battlefield. At first, it looked like a typical war zone, bodies scattered across burned-out cities. But then the bodies began to move. Not natural movements. Jerky, twitching, unnatural. And then they stood up, horribly changed. Metal fused to flesh, glowing cybernetic eyes replacing what had once been human. The room was deathly silent. Elias clenched his fists. "He's not just building soldiers. He's stealing them." Grayson exhaled slowly. "Then we need to stop him. Immediately." Before anyone could respond, alarms screamed through the ship. Red warning lights flashed across the room. A voice came over the speakers. "Emergency alert. We have intruders aboard." Elias's stomach dropped. "How?" Grayson's eyes darkened. "We've been betrayed." Then the doors slammed shut. The lights flickered, and the Collector's voice filled the room. "You cannot escape me." Elias spun, weapon raised, but the walls shifted, the metal warping and twisting. Then Bonner turned his gun on them. Silence. Elias stared at him. "Bonner, what are you doing?" Bonner's expression was blank, his eyes unfocused. A thin, glowing scar ran down the back of his neck, something Elias hadn't noticed before. Thorn gasped. "No." Bonner's voice was hollow. "I'm sorry." Then he opened fire. Elias dived for cover as energy blasts tore through the room. Grayson went down instantly, a smoking hole in his chest. Kiera screamed, trying to reach Bonner, but more gunfire forced her back. Bonner's hands shook as he kept firing. His movements weren't natural. He was fighting himself. "He's been taken," Thorn gasped. "The Collector. He's controlling him." Elias clenched his jaw. "Then we have to break that control." But before he could move, the walls ripped open, and the reclaimed poured in. Half machine, half living nightmares, their bodies twisted by cybernetic implants, glowing red eyes locked onto their targets. The battle erupted. Elias fired, taking down the first reclaimed with a headshot. Kiera used her wrist device to overload the lights, throwing the room into strobing chaos. But Bonner was still shooting at them. Elias moved fast, closing the distance. He slammed into Bonner, knocking the gun from his hands. "Bonner, fight it," he yelled. Bonner's face twisted in pain, his hands clutching his head. I can't." The Collector's voice whispered through the speakers. "He belongs to me now." Elias grabbed Bonner's collar. "You're stronger than this. Fight back." For a second, Bonner's eyes cleared. Then he shoved Elias away. "I can't stop it." His hand reached for a grenade on his belt. Elias realized too late. Bonner's voice was barely a whisper. "I'm sorry." He pulled the pin. Elias lunged, but the explosion tore through the room. Everything went white. When the smoke cleared, Bonner was gone. The betrayal had cost them dearly. And the Collector's war had only just begun. The Tempest was burning. Elias Voss stumbled through the smoke-filled corridor, blood trickling down the side of his face. The explosion from Bonner's sacrifice had bought them time, but the Collectors reclaimed were everywhere now, overrunning the ship like a virus. The air was thick with the smell of scorched metal and burning flesh. Behind him, Kira dragged a barely conscious Dr. Mara Thorne forward, her face streaked with soot and sweat. "Elias, we have to move." He turned, firing down the hallway. His plasma rounds tore through the nearest reclaimed. A twisted fusion of machine and flesh, its body jerking as circuits overloaded. But for every one that fell, more kept coming. Their only chance was the bridge. Elias slammed his fist against the comm panel on the wall. "Tempest, this is Voss. Do you copy? We're en route to the bridge." Static. Then a voice, hoarse but alive. "Voss, this is Rourke. We're barely holding." Elias gritted his teeth. "We're coming." A scream echoed from behind. A reclaimed had broken through, lunging at Kira. She barely dodged, slashing at it with a combat knife. Sparks flew as she jammed the blade into its neck, severing exposed cables. The creature twitched violently, then collapsed. Kira panted. "We can't keep this up." Elias turned to Thorne. "How do we stop them?" Thorne wiped blood from her lip, shaking her head. "The Collector, he's controlling them through a central link. We have to sever it." "How?" She swallowed hard. "We have to destroy him." Elias nodded. "Then let's end this." They reached the final corridor leading to the bridge, only to find the massive blast doors already forced open. And standing in the center of the bridge, waiting for them, was the Collector. The alien warlord stood tall, his robes flowing like living shadow, his glowing eyes locked onto them. Behind him, the crew of the Tempest was on their knees, forced into submission by some invisible force. Rourke was among them, his face bruised, blood dripping from his forehead. The Collector smiled. "Did you really think you could escape your fate?" Elias aimed his rifle. "We're not running anymore." The Collector lifted one clawed hand, and the air itself seemed to ripple. Elias felt his body lock up, an unseen force squeezing his limbs like a vice. "You fight so hard," the Collector murmured, "but in the end, you are nothing." Elias struggled, his muscles screaming in protest. He could hear Kira gasping behind him, pinned in place by the same force. Thorne's voice was a whisper. "He's drawing power from the reclaimed. He's using them as a conduit." Elias's mind raced. If they could break the connection, they could weaken him. His eyes flickered to Kira. She understood. Despite the crushing weight pinning her down, her fingers moved toward her wrist device, typing blindly. The Collector tilted his head. A futile struggle. Elias smirked. Not quite. Kira hit the final key. The ship's emergency systems overloaded in a blinding burst of energy. The lights flickered, and for a split second, the Collector's grip on them weakened. It was all Elias needed. He lunged forward, ignoring the pain, and fired his weapon point blank into the Collector's chest. The blast tore through his robes, revealing the truth beneath, a mass of pulsing cybernetic tendrils, fusing organic flesh with cold, unfeeling metal. The Collector staggered back, snarling in pain. "You will suffer for that." Elias didn't stop. He grabbed a fallen combat blade and drove it deep into the Collector's side. The alien roared, his control over the reclaimed wavering. Across the bridge, Rourke and the others broke free, grabbing their weapons. "Hit him with everything you've got," Elias shouted. The bridge erupted in gunfire. Plasma bolts and explosives tore into the collector, sending pieces of his twisted body flying in every direction. But he still didn't fall. His glowing eyes burned with fury. "You think you have won?" His voice boomed. "I am ETRNL." The entire ship shook violently. Thorn's eyes widened in horror. He's going to self-destruct. Elias didn't hesitate. He turned to Kira. "Get the crew off the ship. Now." "What about you?" she demanded. Elias looked back at the collector, who was still standing despite his injuries. If they didn't stop him here, he would return stronger. "I'm finishing this." Kira's jaw tightened, but she knew there was no time to argue. She grabbed Thorn and Rourke, running toward the escape pods. The crew followed, alarms blaring overhead as the self-destruct countdown began. Elias turned back to the collector. The alien warlord lurched toward him, his body regenerating, metal fusing back together. But Elias wasn't out of tricks yet. He grabbed a detonator from his belt. One last charge, placed in the reactor during the chaos. "You lose," he whispered. Then he hit the switch. The explosion tore through the bridge. The last thing Elias saw was the collector's expression twisting in rage as the flames engulfed them both. The escape pods soared away from the tempest, the survivors watching in silence as the ship detonated in a massive fireball. Kira pressed her forehead against the cold glass, her hands shaking. Thorn sat beside her, eyes red. He did it. Rourke exhaled slowly. He stopped the collector. Silence filled the cabin. Then the comm crackled. A voice, weak, but alive. "This is Elias Voss. If anyone can hear me, I'm still here." Kira's eyes snapped wide open. Elias. Static. Then, "I'm coming home." The crew erupted in cheers. Humanity had won, and Elias Voss was still fighting. The wreckage of the Tempest still burned in the void, pieces of the once mighty battleship floating in the darkness like scattered embers from a dying fire. The last stronghold of humanity's resistance had fallen, but even in destruction, it had served its purpose. The collector was dead, and humanity was still standing. Inside the battered escape ship, Elias Voss sat on the cold metal floor, his back against the wall. His body ached, bruises covering every inch of him, but he was alive. More than that, he had won. Kira crouched beside him, a mixture of relief and frustration on her face. "You were supposed to die back there." Elias smirked, wiping dried blood from his forehead. "Guess I'm not very good at following orders." Rourke chuckled from the cockpit, his hand steady on the flight controls. "Good thing, too. If you had stayed dead, who else would we be following into the next suicidal battle?" Elias let out a breath, looking out the viewport. The stars stretched endlessly before them, but they had no home left, nowhere to return to. Dr. Mara Thorne sat across from him, her arms wrapped around herself. She hadn't spoken much since they'd escaped. Too much loss, too much blood. But they didn't have time to mourn. Elias pushed himself to his feet, ignoring the pain. "What's our status?" Kira exhaled. "We lost over half the crew when the collector's forces boarded. The survivors are split between a handful of escape ships. We sent out distress signals, but no one's answering." Elias clenched his jaw. "Because there's no one left to answer." The collector had spent years wiping out human strongholds, turning our own people into his reclaimed army. He hadn't just been fighting a war. He had been erasing humanity. And now that he was gone, his empire was in chaos. Thorne spoke quietly. "We killed the head, but the body isn't dead yet." Elias turned to her. "Explain." She looked up, her expression grim. The collector controlled his army through a central AI network, but that network still exists. His lieutenants, his war machines, his experiments, they're still out there. And without his command, they won't stop. Elias stared at her. You're saying the reclaimed are still active? She nodded. Not just active, uncontrolled. A chill ran down his spine. The Collector had been the mind guiding his army. Without him, they were nothing but mindless, rampaging monsters. The war wasn't over. It was about to get worse. Kira groaned. Great. So instead of fighting a tyrant, now we have to fight 1,000,000 rogue death machines. Elias rubbed his temples. Pretty much. Rourke sighed. So what's the plan, boss? Elias closed his eyes, forcing himself to think. They had no fleet, no army, no home. Humanity was scattered. But they still had one thing. A spark. He opened his eyes. We find the survivors. We rally whoever's left. Thorn frowned. You want to start a rebellion? He shook his head. No. I want to start a revolution. Kara smirked. Now that's more like it. Their first stop was Dagon 4, a fringe world that had once been a thriving human colony. Now it was just another graveyard. As their ship descended through the planet's ruined atmosphere, they saw the scars of war, burned-out cities, shattered defense turrets, abandoned streets. The Collector's forces had been here. But so had something else. When they landed, they expected silence. Instead, they found survivors. Armed. Organized. Waiting. A group of weathered fighters met them at the landing zone. Their leader, a scared woman with a cybernetic eye and a heavy rifle, stepped forward. You're a hard man to kill, Elias Voss. Elias raised an eyebrow. You know me. She smirked. The whole damn galaxy knows you. You're the one who killed the Collector. Murmurs ran through the gathered survivors. Hope. Suspicion. Desperation. Elias took a slow breath. We're not here to celebrate. We're here because the fight isn't over. The woman nodded. Damn right it isn't. The reclaimed have been tearing through the system, worse than ever. Elias looked past her at the ragtag army of humans, former soldiers, scavengers, civilians turned warriors. They were ready. He turned back to the woman. What's your name? Reyes. Elias extended a hand. Then let's start a revolution. Reyes. She shook it. Took you long enough. The battle for humanity had just begun. And this time, they weren't just fighting to survive. They were fighting to win.